Okay, so continuing our lecture on glucagon. So know that glucagon are released from the alpha cells of pancreatic islets. And I also mentioned that glucagon and insulin, they're antagonists to each other. So insulin helps to decrease blood glucose level and glucagon helps to increase blood glucose level. So when do we need that? We need more blood glucose levels when we are fasting, right? So obviously when we are fasting, the blood glucose concentration gets too low. And that stimulates the alpha cells to produce glucagon. Now, glucagon works in three ways. It first stimulates the liver to hydrolyze glycogen and release glucose into the bloodstream. Remember, in liver, all the glucose that are taken up, the glucose then forms something called glycogen. We talked about that. So glucagon stimulates liver to hydrolyze glycogen to release glucose. Glucagon also promotes the process of gluconeogenesis, which is pretty much synthesis of glucose molecules from non-carb sources. Glucagon also promotes lipolysis and ketogenesis. And by this process, free fatty acids and ketone bodies are released into the bloodstream, which serve as energy source for cell respiration. Okay? All right. Now, 1 and 2, do you see I have put 1, 2, and 3? If 1 and 2 combined, obviously, both these processes release glucose into blood. This releases glucose into blood. This releases glucose into blood. So 1 and 2 helps to release glucose into the blood, and that obviously increases or elevates blood glucose level, bringing things back to homeostasis. Okay? So this slide is showing us the pancreas. So this leaf-like organ is your pancreas. And if you zoom in, if you take a little section and zoom in, you see the islets. These are the pancreatic islets made up of the alpha and the beta cells. Okay. So talking about the action of insulin. So here, this is the insulin hormone. It binds to receptor. Do you see this? It binds to the receptor on the plasma membrane. And that triggers a cascade of reactions inside the cell. Now, as insulin binds to the specific receptor, we have vesicles inside the cell that has the GLUT4 carrier proteins. Binding of insulin to the receptor causes these vesicles to insert more GLUT proteins into the plasma membrane. So now we have all these carrier proteins or GLUT proteins sticking to the plasma membrane. And as a result of this, we can have more glucose molecules being diffused inside the cell, right? And this process acts in adipose tissues, skeletal muscles, and also in the liver cells. Okay, now as glucose is transported into the cell, another thing happens. Insulin also indirectly stimulates the enzyme glycogen synthase. Remember, we talked about glycogen synthase in my previous slide. So as more and more glucose are being transported into the cell, the enzyme glycogen synthase, this one, kind of helps these glucose molecules to stick together and form long glycogen molecules, which are stored in the liver and skeletal muscles. Okay, So glucagon, as I mentioned before, it's antagonistic to insulin. It is secreted by the alpha cells in response to low blood glucose levels. And the purpose of glucagon is to raise blood glucose level to a normal range, bringing things back to homeostasis. Diagram showing the function of insulin versus glucagon. And I'm not going over this since I already drew out the chart. You feel free to study this diagram, and if you don't understand something, email me. Talking about diabetes mellitus. Okay. Diabetes mellitus is characterized by fasting hyperglycemia, meaning even if you are fasting, you have a lot of blood glucose in your blood, and presence of glucose in urine. There are two major forms of diabetes. Type 1 diabetes, once called insulin-dependent diabetes mellitus, is caused by destruction of the beta cells. So type 1 diabetes is caused by destruction of the beta cells and the resulting lack of insulin secretion. So in case of type 1 diabetes, we do not secrete insulin. Type 2 diabetes, once called non-insulin dependent diabetes mellitus, is the most common form. So most of us are affected with type 2 diabetes. It is caused largely by insulin resistance or decreased tissue sensitivity to the effect of insulin, so that larger than normal amounts of insulin are required to produce a normal effect. So here the cells, the target cells, they lose their sensitivity to insulin, and you have to kind of you have to supply more insulin to the target cells to cause them to uptake glucose molecules. The causes, symptoms of diabetes mellitus are we will focus on the causes and symptoms more in upcoming chapters. There is another type of diabetes called gestational diabetes, which occur in about 4% of pregnant women. And this happens because the insulin that is secreted by the mother is not enough to meet the increased demand imposed by the fetus and the anti-insulin effect of certain placental hormones. Pregnant women who do not develop gestational diabetes have a sufficiently increased insulin secretion, probably due to the proliferation of beta cells in the islets. Moving on to pineal gland. Hold on. Okay. Now, in this diagram, we see the pineal gland right here. So, this is your pineal gland right here. It's located on the roof of the third ventricle of the diencephalon. And the pineal gland has no direct connection to the brain. The pineal gland is innervated by the sympathetic nervous system. And we also know that the pineal gland releases a hormone called melatonin. So the question is, how does the secretion of pineal gland take place? Okay. Now, when photons of light stimulate the retina of the eye, a nerve impulse is sent to the region of the hypothalamus called suprachiasmatic nucleus. You don't have to remember the term. So what do we see here? We have light, daylight, focusing on the eye, and that impulse travels to this specific nucleus. This impulse travels to the specific nucleus. Okay. And this nucleus, or the suprachiasmatic nucleus, is important in regulating biological rhythms. From the suprachiasmatic nucleus, the nerve signal is carried to the spinal cord. So from here, the nerve impulse goes to the spinal cord. And eventually to the pineal gland. Eventually it goes to the pineal gland right here, where the production of melatonin is inhibited. As a result, blood level of melatonin falls, promoting wakefulness. So, one more time. Lot of daylight. Signal goes to the eye, travels to the suprachiasmatic nucleus. From there, the impulse goes to the spinal cord. From spinal cord, the impulse goes to the pineal gland. And in response to that, the pineal gland secretes less melatonin. So in daylight, we have less melatonin, and that helps us to remain awake. In contrast, as high levels of In contrast, as light levels decline, such as during the evening, melatonin production increases, boosting blood levels and causing drowsiness. So just the opposite thing happens at night. So at night, low light, and that results in more production of melatonin, or increased production or secretion of melatonin by the pineal gland, that makes us drowsy. Okay. All right. Now, the secretion of melatonin may influence body's circadian rhythms, which is the day-night cycle, and affects not only sleepiness and wakefulness, but also appetite and body temperature. Interestingly, children have higher melatonin levels than adults, which may prevent the release of gonadotropins from the anterior pituitary, thereby inhibiting onset of puberty. Jet lag. Jet lag occurs when a person travels across several time zones and feels sleepy during the day or wakeful at night. Traveling across multiple time zones significantly disturbs the light-dark cycle regulated by the melatonin. It can take up to several days for melatonin synthesis. To adjust to the light-dark pattern in the new environment, resulting in jet lag. I'll stop here and make another video.